session after lunch, and the title is Global and Strategic Issues. I got to commend the organizers for putting together the idea for this panel, which must have taken place a few months ago. And given recent events, it's quite apt. So around 400 BC, Greek historian Thucydides argued that war is not so much a matter of arms as it is a matter of money. And a few years later, Dwight Eisenhower had a similar quotation arguing that the foundation of military strength is economic strength. And other leaders have further asserted that international economic integration is essential for forming the alliances underpinning national security. For example, Prime Minister Winston Churchill argued that through trade, we find the means to preserve peace and project power. And following World War II, the US followed Churchill's strategy. It created a vast web of international institutions that fostered freer trade. And the goals were very clear and very clearly articulated that this freer, more competitive markets would generate long-run economic benefits for the US and those countries joining the network. And those economic allies would become a strategic alliance against communism. The success of this strategy and further lessons from history led former US Secretary of Defense and our Hoover Fellow, Jim Mattis, to argue, throughout history, we see nations with allies thrive and nations without allies wither. These observations raise important questions about the future of US economic power and national security in light of recent US policy initiatives. And I look forward to learning more from the panelists on this issue. Furthermore, many may make the mistake of viewing each economic policy in isolation. For example, extraordinary attention has been given to international trade and potentially the international trade war with China. And obviously this is a central concern, and one, again, I'm sure our panelists will talk about. However, US trade policy has ramifications beyond trade in the winners and losers of tariffs in the domestic economy. For example, we know that international capital surpluses mirror trade deficits. The connection between international trade and international finance therefore raises a whole slew of questions about the repercussions of attacking the trade deficit. This attack may increase the cost of US federal debt, increase the costs to US firms of raising capital financing for investments, and increase the costs to US households of borrowing to buy homes or other items. Furthermore, trade policy reforms that increase the costs to the government and firms of raising capital can slow economic growth, boost deficits, and accelerate the day of reckoning with our fiscal debt burden, which will be covered in the next session. So examining trade policy in isolation is a potentially grave mistake, given that trade is linked to growth and finance and fiscal and monetary policies more generally. And again, I hope to learn much more about this from our panelists. With that, each speaker will have 12 minutes to make opening remarks. Then we'll throw it open to the floor and questions. And I'm going to first turn it over to H.R. McMaster, the former National Security Advisor and wonderful colleague. And H.R., it's all yours.
Thanks for the privilege of being here for this great conference and to honor just an amazing colleague, John Taylor, one of the many people from whom I've learned so much here at the Hoover Institution. I'm applying for college credit in economics since I've been here since 2018. I think I've earned it, but and hopefully a little bit of it is rubbing off on this washed-up general. But I'm here to set up the panel to talk really about how economics and financial dimensions of economic power play into, I think, what is the most significant competition of this century, and that's the competition with the Chinese Communist Party. I believe it's going to be the defining competition of this century because free and open societies, I think, appear at the moment at a position of disadvantage. And I think at a position of disadvantage really having to do with China, the Chinese Communist Party, and its axis of aggressors that include China and another revanchist power in the Eurasian landmass of Russia, as well as Iran and North Korea, largely because we had disengaged from critical aspects of the competition with authoritarian regimes in the post-Cold War period. Because of really three interlocking and what turned out to be fundamentally flawed assumptions about the nature of the post-Cold War world. First, that an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. Secondly, that great power competition was a relic of the past, and then finally that our prowess, our technological military prowess, would guarantee our security well into the future. And those assumptions, I think, really betrayed what I would call strategic narcissism, the tendency to define the world only in relation to us and assume that what we do or choose not to do is decisive toward achieving a favorable outcome. And of course, there are others who enjoy authorship over the future, and that includes this axis of aggressors. So what I recommend first, as a first step, is we have to overcome that narcissistic view and apply what a visiting fellow here, Zach Shore, a fantastic historian, calls strategic empathy. And that's really a concerted effort to view the complex challenges we face from the perspective of the other and try to understand better the emotions and the ideology and the aspirations that drive and constrain others, especially our enemies, adversaries, and rivals. So, these assumptions about the post-Cold War world turned out to be false. In this century, a new great power competition has emerged. The actions of the Chinese Communist Party, actions driven by party's leaders' fears and ambitions, I would argue, have revealed to the world that its Leninist system will prevent the Chinese people from realizing Milton Friedman's and John Taylor's vision of a free market that empowers individuals and drives prosperity by allowing people to make their own choices. As Milton Friedman observed, underlying most arguments against the free market is a lack of belief in freedom itself. The party is intensifying efforts to extend and tighten its exclusive grip on power internally and gain preponderant power in pursuit of this vision of national rejuvenation externally through a campaign of what I would describe as the 3 C's of co-option, coercion, and concealment. China co-opts countries, international corporations, and elites with false promises of impending liberalization, insincere pledges to work on global issues, and especially the lure of short-term profits, access to the Chinese market, and access to Chinese investments and loans. Co-option includes debt traps set for corrupt or weak governments. Co-option makes companies and corporations dependent and vulnerable to coercion. The party coerces others to ignore its efforts to extinguish human freedom internally, as it did with the case of the National Basketball Association, quite famously, but many others, and many U.S. and international companies as well. It applies coercive power to reshape the international order to favor its authoritarian form of governance and its statist mercantilist economic model. Examples of CCP's subversion of international institutions includes, the World Health Organization, the Human Rights Council, UNESCO, even ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. That's just to name a few. So, to compete effectively, we must correct fundamental misunderstandings concerning the nature of the threat from the Chinese Communist Party, and then discuss how the free world might prevail in that competition and secure a better future for generations to come, because the stakes are high. I mean, if the Chinese Communist Party wins, the world is less free, less prosperous, and less safe. So a common understanding of the nature of that threat is what I'd like to talk with you about, and then talk about how we can generate the resolve and take actions to turn what authoritarian regimes regard as our free societies and free market economies' weaknesses into our greatest competitive advantages. The Chinese Communist Party uses 2 fundamental misunderstandings to get away with various forms of aggression internally as it perfects its technologically enabled Orwellian police state, and externally as it pursues primacy through programs such as military-civil fusion, Made in China 2025, and One Belt, One Road. If you want a quick primer on these, not that any of you need it, our colleague Liz Economy just did a fantastic policy ed video where she lays out all of these mechanisms of coercion and these programs and strategies that the CCP employs. And these include, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and most ambitious and maybe scariest of all, I would argue, the Global Civilization Initiative, which aim to extend CCP influence over economic, security, and cultural governance worldwide. So what are these misunderstandings? The first misunderstanding is that Chinese aggression is the result of U.S.-China tensions, or is a reaction to, just Donald Trump being so mean, right? And it derives, I think, from this narcissistic assumption that the party has, again, no aspirations of its own and has no volition except in reaction to the United States. However, I think we should consider the party's deliberate suppression of the COVID-19 outbreak, the persecution of doctors, journalists, and others who tried to warn the world about COVID-19, and the subversion of the World Health Organization. Adding insult to injury, in the post-COVID period, the CCP employed wolf warrior diplomacy to obscure China's responsibility for foisting the pandemic on the world and portrayed China's response as superior to the responses in the rest of the world. Also, I think, consider the massive global cyber attacks on medical research facilities in the midst of the pandemic, and the punitive cyber attacks and economic coercion of Australia, and the most recent cyber attacks, the Volt attacks that we've experienced or identified to place a latent offensive cyber capability in America's critical infrastructure. In 2024, the U.S. Department of Justice revealed that the China-linked cyber group Volt Typhoon had infiltrated our critical infrastructure. And of course, it just doesn't end there in cyberspace. There's lots of physical aggression happening in the South China Sea, vis-a-vis Taiwan, bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier. And then I think what we should really consider is Xi Jinping's boasts of his intention to not to be constrained in any way, but to extend his efforts to coerce his own people and extinguish human freedom there. The recent actions in Hong Kong, Jimmy Lai and others' incarceration, but his bragging that he's going to expand the concentration camps in Xinjiang. So I think it should be clear to us that it's not the United States or even how mean Donald Trump is, that is causing this problem and this behavior. So I think what we should acknowledge is that CCP aggression is not a U.S. problem. It's a whole world, and especially a free world problem. The second misunderstanding is that competition with China is dangerous or even irresponsible because of a Thucydides trap that presents us with a binary choice between passivity and destructive war. That's a false dilemma. I would argue that passivity in connection with CCP aggression in the South China Sea and elsewhere had put us on a path to conflict with China because China was emboldened by that passivity. And so I think that what we have to recognize is that the party promotes this false dilemma. It loves kind of the slight misinterpretation of the book, The Thucydides Trap, to portray efforts to defend against its aggression as simply the status quo power, the United States trying to keep the rising power, China, and its people down. So it's important to reject the Thucydides trap and this idea that it's a choice between Beijing and Washington. I think it's very important to communicate to our friends and partners around the world that this is not a choice between Washington and Beijing. It's a choice between sovereignty and servitude. And this is why, as Ross alluded to in the beginning, to confront China's aggression, it's really important, I think, to have a concerted multinational response. And years ago, 2017, 2018, I would often say to President Trump, hey, Mr. President, if we shoot all of our allies to get to China, China wins. And so I'm hoping that President Trump will recognize that for us to prevail in this competition, we have to work with at least the other of the world's largest free market economies and work together. So I think that connecting these misunderstandings and improved cooperation with allies is important if we're to compete. And again, what we should be thinking about is how do we turn what the party views as our weaknesses into our greatest competitive advantages? And so we have competitive advantages in our free market economies and in what we regard as unalienable universal rights. The party views freedom of expression as a weakness to be suppressed at home and exploited abroad. But it's the free exchange of information and ideas that may be our greatest competitive advantage. And I'll go through these quickly so we can get to discussion. Freedom of expression and freedom of the press also play a key role in promoting good governance to inoculate countries from these bad deals under One Belt, One Road, these predatory loans and so forth. As with freedom of expression, the CCP views tolerance of diversity as a threat. Although some might see expanded immigration from an authoritarian state as a danger, the United States and other free and open societies should consider issuing more visas, providing more paths to citizenships, especially for those who have the knowledge, skills, abilities that can help us maintain our competitive advantages. What President Trump has said in the past, staple that H-1B visa to any graduate who has earned an advanced degree in math, science, and engineering. The CCP views its centralized, statist economic model as bestowing advantages, especially the ability to successfully coordinate efforts across government, business, academia, and the military. And it views our decentralized free market economic systems as unable to compete with China's centrally directed strategies. And I think that's why our free market economies need to demonstrate the competitive advantage of decentralization and unconstrained entrepreneurship. So competition between the free world and authoritarian regimes will determine, I believe, whether democracy and free market economies prevail over authoritarian and statist economic models. China and Russia have expanded, of course, this self-described partnership for no limits. There is kind of unprecedented degree of cooperation going on among this axis of aggressors, and I think it's really important for us to no longer undervalue the degree to which strategic application of economic power, and Matteo will have some tremendous ideas on this, is essential for advancing U.S. vital interests. I believe President Trump has an historic opportunity to correct this chronic shortcoming in U.S. grand strategy with an integrated strategy for economic statecraft oriented on securing the nation, reinforcing our technological innovation systems, and shaping fair reciprocal trade and commercial relationships. But action is necessary to counter Chinese economic aggression. The Trump administration, I think, must recognize that more interventionist and economic statecraft policies will inevitably result in trade-offs. An overarching framework for principles and objectives of strategy, which is what we argued in a paper, so I won't go into any detail on this, is essential to help policymakers decide among competing trade-offs and to determine the best way to integrate the tools of economic statecraft to advance our interests. So finally, I'll just say that strengthening free market economies and democratic governance could be the best means of countering CCP's campaign of co-option, coercion, and concealment. Strengthening democratic institutions and processes in our own nation and in nations that are targeted by the CCP should be a matter of urgent importance to us. And so I'm confident because of all of you here, the wisdom that's in this room, and I'm confident that support for free markets and democratic institutions, as well as the unalienable rights that should be afforded to all peoples, is not just an exercise in altruism, but protection of those rights and promotion of democratic governance is a practical means of competing effectively with the CCP while building a better world for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, HR. Matteo, it's all yours.
So first, let me join in congratulating John on the conference yesterday and everything that you've done for economics, both in the profession and at large in policy. Is really a remarkable career, and I think we're all very lucky to have learned from you. Now, for the specifics of what I'm talking about, I knew that HR was going to talk about the military, and he knows infinitely more about that than I do, simply because I know zero about it. He's also very knowledgeable, but me knowing zero helps. The second thing, I knew he was going to talk about China, and so I thought I would talk more about the US side. So HR has an incredibly good report online on a proposal for more systematic economic statecraft. Just thinking about what do we want to do, what are the objectives, and coordinating the policies so that we don't come at it from an haphazard perspective. And so I'm going to review what we've done so far instead of doing that. If you could advance the slides for me. Let me start from the fiscal situation, okay, because this is rather important. These are all familiar to all of you. It's not my data. This is the CBOE, and it's plotting federal debt held by the public in the United States. So it's no secret that the debt has been going up rapidly since before the global financial crisis, as we spent for the fiscal response to the financial crisis, then again for the fiscal response to the pandemic. And the last part of the line is not an expectation, is what the CBOE expects would happen if we did nothing, if we went on with the current legislation. So you can see that we're at the highest debt to GDP levels, certainly in the post-war period. The last time we were there, the debt that financed the war. If you advance the slides, the way we would think of them as economists is the following simple graph. If you have very little debt over GDP, there is a safe equilibrium. Everybody knows that debt is safe because you're going to repay it because you want to borrow in the future. If you push it a little farther, things get more interesting, not in the good sense. Now you're in an intermediate region, which is called the instability zone, where there are two possibilities. If the foreigners or the domestics get scared about what you're going to do to the debt, for example, because you're mentioning forceful extensions or not paying interest rates spike. At those high interest rates, since the debt is high, repayment is too expensive, and you actually decide not to repay, fulfilling the expectation that they should be scared about you. Now, the other equilibrium, the good one, is still present. If they don't get scared and they give you low interest rates, given those low interest rates, even with a high debt, you repay, fulfilling those expectations. So now you have two possibilities. And when you have two possibilities, it becomes a game of confidence. Which equilibrium is going to show up tomorrow? And these things can be stable for a very, very long time, and then go down in flame very quickly. And then, of course, there is a region where you borrow so much that it's pretty obvious you're going to default, and interest rates are high, and that's the only possibility. If you flip one more slide for me. Now, if you go back to the previous graph, the big question that we all have right now is, have we entered that instability zone? I mean, clearly at 60% debt to GDP ratios, we all thought it was only going to be safe. At 100%, we don't really know where the lines are. It's difficult to estimate them, but we started having this conversation. So when Emmanuel Farid and I wrote that paper 10 years ago, people thought we were absolutely insane for even mentioning the possibility that US debt will not be safe. And today, this possibility is routinely mentioned in the press. Now, you might still think it's insane and very low, but we're having the discussion. Fast forward when we're 150% debt to GDP ratios, and we'll have that conversation a lot more, and you'll start thinking it's a lot less crazy. And you don't want to get there. Now, with this in mind, you want to think about what is happening right now with US policy, and both with the holders of our debt and our partners. So if you can forward. If you think of the Latin motto of once safe and always safe, that's a recipe for disaster. Once investors start thinking that since the US has been safe for a while, it will always be safe, that's generally how you get into trouble. It's exactly how we thought about the banks going in 2008. And when you look through the arc of history, and some of my colleagues will do substantially better than me at this, there is nothing that should make you confident that because you've been a reserve country for long enough, you'll always be. England had a stellar reputation in the classic gold standard and during the interwar period, and ended up going off the gold standard, which is largely a form of default on a promise. At the beginning of the Depression, it depreciated 30% unexpectedly and never really recovered its reputation. You look at other reserve currencies in history that suffer the same fate. So it doesn't have to happen, but it's also not guaranteed. You cannot do whatever you want because this is a birthright. This is something that you get because investors are confident in your future fiscal and monetary policy, and that combination is going to keep the value of the debt stable. So if you forward for me again. Now, if you think about this, with this sort of risky background on our fiscal situation, there has been a big surge in geoeconomic activity. You've all seen the headlines between tariffs, export controls, deals with China that might or might not happen, certainly a rethink of even our basic relationship with the European Union or Canada or Mexico. The world order is clearly going through a moment of unprecedented change, certainly during my lifetime and for most of your lifetimes, particularly with our closest allies. And that's worrisome because if you're already in a position where you don't want bad outcomes, you don't want further uncertainty, provoking those kind of rethinking, it's not usually the most advisable strategy. And I wanted to give you a sense of what's happening in real time. Could you forward me? So what I've been doing in my research in the last few months is essentially using artificial intelligence to read hundreds of thousands of documents in almost real time to try to figure out how are firms responding to sanctions, export controls, and tariffs. So the blue line that you can see here, and this is all online, you can download it, you can see that there are three big spikes. One big spike is the earlier Trump administration. Those are the tariffs with China. The firms are massively reporting being worried about this. They're being affected. Then there is a spike in 2022. Those are the sanctions on Russia. There's sanctions on export controls. And then you can see that the line goes vertical. So this data is updated to April 24. So every firm is reporting being very worried about tariffs or being affected. Now, if you forward one, you can ask, how are they talking about this? They might be talking about tariffs, but saying they're a great idea. Or they might be talking about tariffs and saying, we think these are going to be bad for us. And here, the line is decomposed into the positive and negatives, and largely you only see the negatives. The firms are all reporting the tariffs being negative for their economic outcomes. And this happens even when you restrict to only American firms. There is a spike to the positive. You can see it at the very bottom corner. What is the positive? Those are American firms that report their competitors being more affected than them from the tariffs, in particular, for example, like steel, and therefore they're thinking that they're going to get a bigger market share. So that's a domestic subsidy of production component of a tariff. But overall, if you look at least what the firms and the professional analysts are reporting, there is no shred of a doubt that the reaction is negative. They're perceiving them as being negative. If you go one further, you can then ask deeper, how exactly are they reacting to this environment? What are they doing? And you can see three interesting things. The first one is they're trying to go around this. They're trying to reroute the supply chains to make sure that they get low effectiveness. The second thing is that you see a big difference between sanctions and export controls and tariffs. When you look at the reactions to tariffs, they all mention moving prices. And I'll show you in a second that the prices are going up. They're reporting increasing prices. It's an ad valorem tax. We're not telling you that you can't do the activity. We're telling you that we're going to charge you for doing the activity. And they're passing through some of these tax to the buyer. When you look instead at export controls, those are quantity restrictions or sanctions. We're telling you you cannot do this activity, or you can do it up to a maximum. And there you can see that the major reaction is market exit. We're telling you you cannot export to China, you cannot export to Russia, you cannot buy from Russia. And so this is a little bit of the difference between the Jack Sullivan, high fence, small yard versus, generalized tariffs. They're very much talked about in some components as both being for national security, but they're vastly different how they're affecting the firms. One thing is a restriction on a few technologies that people like HR might have the deep expertise to say these are affecting our military, or they might be posing a competition. And one thing is a generalized, potentially very high tariff on all inputs that we buy anywhere in the world, including those that might make us stronger. If you go to the next slide. So this is the major worry right now, it's prices. When you ask, okay, you told me that you're adjusting prices, but are they going up or down? They're going up. And they're going up more by American firms than they are by the rest of the world. And that's a major worry that, for example, Jay Powell articulated earlier this week of we're going to face a weak demand and at the same time a shock to inflation. And if you're trying, if you're a sitting central banker, that's not a great combination to have to fight. It's a tightrope to be handled. So these we're going to keep doing. One of the great things of being at Stanford, and let me publicize it, is the university has made very large investments in artificial intelligence. So we can do these things in real time and at scale. And we're going to keep tracking this. And so if you're interested in this type of data and economic policy, you can find it online. But the policy message is, when you look at the data for April, or the data for March for the lead up, is massive uncertainty. A lot of it is in our traditional allies, is across the board. The firms are largely reporting negative outcomes. The positive outcomes are coming from the few firms that think they're going to get a bigger market share or higher profit margins because their competitors are more affected by the tariffs than themselves. And the biggest response seems to be, we're increasing prices, we're moving our supply chains. I'm not sure that that's what we wanted. If that was the plan, this did it. If the plan was something else, then we have to confront it. These are the outcomes so far, and see if we can change the policies to get to the outcomes that we would have liked. Last one. So if you're interested, this one is online. I know that a lot of you are interested in real-time data, so you can grab it. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be on this very esteemed panel and to be here on this great occasion. So thank you to the organizers for a job well done. I want to talk about the second wave of globalization and the first wave of globalization and make some kind of long-run comparisons. The second wave of globalization, this period of intensified international trade, cross-border movement of capital and migration, prevailed between 1950 and 2008. And this recent period of globalization was founded on a strong belief that economic integration was a handmaiden of economic growth and development and geopolitical stability at that. Hegemonic leadership by the United States and its allies provided the cornerstone of globalization. But since January 2025, I think the US has abruptly changed the terms of the agreement. The United States has basically started a global trade war, clamped down on immigration, mooted the possibility of meddling in foreign investment, emphasized the burden of operating the world's dominant currency. These strategic changes have implications for economic growth and stability, as well as economic policy. So how do we reach this crossroads? Well, I think the global financial crisis of 2008 probably played a role. Lots of things have been happening since then. I think the second factor, as was mentioned before, was the rise of a new global superpower, China. Since reforms in the 1980s, that economy has grown at double-digit rates. Exports have been booming, GDP is rising, and it's turned an impoverished nation into and populous nation into a manufacturing powerhouse. I think some economists and policymakers and others attribute China's rise to unfair trade practices, overgenerous subsidies, expropriation of Western technologies, and even an undervalued exchange rate. And many advocated sanctions on China because of these forces. So the first significant action has really come as of late in the first Trump administration with tariffs of 10% against China, and most recently tariffs which are basically prohibitive of up to 125% on China with some exceptions. Not only that, but President Trump has decided to raise tariffs on other close trading partners like Canada and Mexico, and there's a threat that by July 2025, significant tariffs could be higher on all trade partners in proportion to bilateral trade imbalances. So with that introduction, I want to talk a little bit about tariffs and trade costs in the United States case over the long run. I want to talk about the trade wars of the past with special emphasis on the Great Depression, and then come around to likely scenarios for the near term in the United States economy. One justification for tariffs recently was, and I want to quote this, President McKinley made our country very rich through tariffs, and we were at our richest from 1870 to 1913. That's when we were a tariff nation, close quote. The historical record is obviously at odds with this assertion. Back in the 19th century, when tariffs were quite high, GDP per capita was about $6,000 in 2017 dollars, and the economy hasn't stopped growing. It's much higher than it used to be as tariffs have come down. Not only that, recent research that I've undertaken with Alex Klein, looking at disaggregated data from the US economy in the Gilded Age, shows that industries with higher tariffs were actually less productive. Their labor productivity was lower when tariffs were higher. So there doesn't seem to be much truth in the idea that tariffs promoted growth. Well, what did? Well, I think it's fair to say that America grew rich despite tariffs, not because of them. What mattered were things like natural resources, innovation, agglomeration, building out the railroad network, and all sorts of forces like that. Recent research by Rick Hornbeck and Martin Rottenberg has showed that counties that got connected to the railroad network were dramatically more productive. They opened their market access, and it did them well. In fact, looking at the opposite, this business historian, James Foreman Peck, looked at the automobile industry in the beginning of the 20th century and argued that the U.S. engineers were a little bit behind, quite behind European engineers solving problems that they had already solved in Europe, and he attributed that backwardness to 45% tariffs in that industry and a lack of competition. Regarding the first wave of globalization and all these ups and downs, sure, if you want to get more information on this, there's a great book on it. It's at your disposal on Amazon and from Oxford. What I've learned in writing that book and in the course of years of research on this is that more open economies tend to be richer. This is true in 1900 when countries lowered their trade barriers with the rest of the world and were more proximate to other rich countries. They were better off, they were richer. Not only that, but in the late 19th century, integration was not a barrier to cooperation. Research with Michael Huberman shows that greater integration with leading countries led to leverage over their trade partners, to persuade trade partners to improve their labor standards to match their own. The carrot of continued market access and implicit trade sanctions was virtually always enough to bring trade partners in line and to improve their labor standards like the advanced countries. Globalization kind of collapsed in the Great Depression. It was a bad scene. The trade war kind of kicked off in 1930 when the United States, with the Smoot-Hawley tariff, raised tariffs by over 50%. This led to retaliation and protest with our trade partners. Against protesters, exports fell about 18%, and against retaliators by about 31%, according to research by Chris Michner. The trade war of the 1930s raised tariffs from an average of 6% to about 25% amongst the largest economies, and it wasn't good for economic growth. To the extent that you can see these numbers, it's not a great scene. For these 28 countries, export to GDP ratios in the trade war of the early 1930s fell by about 17%. The average decline in output was about 23%. And in ongoing research with Thilo Albers, building on his dissertation at the LSE, we're finding that about 63% of the decline in GDP was attributable to the trade war. So small open economies are harmed significantly by higher tariffs, and some of the damage done was on the order of 100% for some of the small open economies. Further, the period of the 1930s wasn't great for freedom and liberty. The demise of globalization was associated with the rise of fascism, and previous research has shown a figure like this. In the second wave of globalization, Globalization 2.0, I think it's fair to say that the countries that have more and better market access are still richer. They're doing better. Contrary to some things you may hear, globalization has been good for jobs, even in the United States. My colleague Rob Feenstra estimated that several million jobs were created in this later period of globalization in recent decades. Globalization 2.0 created a sort of Pax Americana, or liberal peace, where territorial integrity was largely maintained. Things have, well, there's actually a bonus here too in the last period of globalization, Globalization 2.0, rising trade integration was associated with a rise in democracy. Things have kind of changed in the last 100 days. Tariffs have gone up to an average of 23% in this country. That is remarkably high. That's a tenfold increase off our average tariff of 2.4%, which prevailed at the end of 2024. There's been a clampdown on immigration, which is having a chilling effect on visits to the United States for work, leisure, and study. And people are actually discussing the role of the dollar on the international scene. So what's going to happen? Well, I don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty. Lots of things could happen. Here are some possibilities based off of history. It's pretty clear that in the immediate short run, prices are going to be higher. We're going to face shortages. Producers are going to find it difficult to source important inputs. It's going to be a lot of self-harm. In the medium term, I think over the next few months, we could see quite a lot of retaliation, even more than we've already seen. And this is only going to lead to continued deterioration in the U.S. economy. This would lead to worse terms of trade, falling employment, and things we're already about to see, but even worse. Think of the Great Depression, and you don't have to be convinced given that data. Uncertainty remains high. This is having a stifling effect on consumption and investment, and henceforth employment. And I would like to think that the Fed would probably prioritize employment than think about the inflation costs of all these actions. Time is getting close to ending. Let me just end with a hopefully a little bit more rosy scenario. We could call it Globalization 2.1. I don't know if it's the most plausible, but it's good to dream. In this world, we could imagine a world where the threat of higher tariffs from the US lead to reductions of tariffs and non-tariff barriers with our trade partners. This could happen with our main trade partners, Canada, Mexico, EU, Korea, Japan, which covers about 85% of US exports, which would already be a big boost to GDP, adding probably several percentage points to economic growth. That would be a good scenario. Now, China's kind of adopting a posture of, retaliation, and it seems to be, a little angered by recent moves. But if China were to come into the fold and lower some of its non-tariff barriers and make some adjustments in its economy towards boosting domestic consumption, things could improve even more. The US could improve its exports in leading sectors like AI, cloud, other IT, finance, insurance, and even the primary sector, and that could be a big boom. We could see greater integration, lower prices, an easing Fed, and it would be kind of like a positive supply shock. Again, I don't know if this is the world that's the most plausible. This world would definitely be richer, it'd be safer, and I think that's a case, it's a scenario worth hoping for at the very least. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much. It's wonderful being here, wonderful being on this panel, and especially listening and thinking about John Taylor's work. It's been fantastically useful. And I think also for historians who go back and look at monetary history and episodes, even of catastrophic monetary mistakes in the past, having your framework really helps us in doing that analysis. You won't be surprised if I have some of the points that we've already heard in this wonderful panel. I mean, in some ways, the story that I think Chris is telling and I'm telling is that it's a kind of back to the future scenario, that we've had terrible moments in the past, and it looks to many of us as if we're reliving some of those episodes. So I think one of the great analysts of this is Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist, writing just at the end of the First World War, in the moment of a big catastrophe: nationalism and militarism, and not the creatures of capitalism, are capitalized and end by sucking the best strength out of capitalism. And that's the danger that we're running into. And in particular, I think it's fascinating that the figure that Schumpeter focused on, and the work was originally written in German, but Schumpeter quotes this figure, Joseph Chamberlain, speaking in English. Joseph Chamberlain, the great master orator, the transformative politician of the late 19th century, the early 20th century, who was the tariff man in late 19th century Britain, and pushed for tariffs and pushed for imperialism. Those are the two linked motives that Chamberlain pushed again and again. And it was also very explicitly linked to a narrative that Chamberlain was very fond of beginning his presentations by, his big orations in Birmingham City Hall, elsewhere. He started off by saying that Britain was in the decline. And the story that he had was very much, really absolutely the same kind of story as we have in terms of the relationship of the discussion US versus China. For Chamberlain, that was Britain confronted by a rising imperial Germany, an autocratic Germany, that was distorting the rules and doing many unfair things from the point of view of Chamberlain's narrative. Some of the unfair things they were doing don't seem to us to be so unfair. They were having good universities. They were having a lot of research in basic industries. And so there really was a problem. But one of the points that I think you have to make, and Chris has already made that, is that Chamberlain's recipes that were then implemented by his son, Neville Chamberlain, as Chancellor of the Exchequer and then as Prime Minister in the 1930s, did more to precipitate British decline, and in the end also led, and particularly spectacularly, as I think people know with Neville Chamberlain, led to colossal geopolitical mistakes in terms of what Neville Chamberlain was doing in 1938 and 1939. So this is an example of somebody who gets it wrong. So let me turn to the same kind of material that Chris has gone through, thinking about the long waves of globalization. You've heard it already, that there's globalization 1 in the middle of the 19th century and globalization 2 from the 1970s onwards, and that these are transformative. I've also been thinking about this for a long time, and what I think of as increasingly important is trying to identify what occurs at the switching points when globalization turns in one direction or another, when it surges in the middle of the 19th century, when it surges after the 1970s, or when it's broken in the interwar period by the First World War, and then particularly by the Great Depression and by tariff conflicts and the story that you heard already. What are they? Well, it seems to me that it's important here to distinguish between supply shocks and demand shocks, and that in particular, there's a remarkable pattern that we get out of this study of the long waves of globalization, that it's negative supply shocks, really severe negative supply shocks, that make people realize that their existing models are broken and that they need a better, more open approach to policy. And that's what happened in the middle of the 19th century. That's when the great free traders prevailed intellectually, when John Bright, Richard Cobden were thrust into positions of authority. That's the story of the 1970s, when we think of Milton Friedman becoming enormously influential. And people of different political backgrounds pick this up and think that openness is the key. Why? Because there are supply constraints. And in the middle of the 19th century, it was food. In the 1970s, it was oil, energy, petroleum. And in these cases, the prices that are the result of the negative supply shocks send signals that more investment is needed and more linkages are needed. And so the technologies that are already available, for instance, the steam engine that powers the railways and the transoceanic shipping in the middle of the 19th century, instead of using them just for little local expeditions, local routes, you can use them to create big networks, and you can feed Europe as a consequence of developing big networks of railroads and transoceanic shipping. Or in the 1970s, the container had already existed as a concept. There were containers in the 1930s, I believe. From 1950s, there were regular container shipments between New York and Florida, but just that one route. And then in the 1970s, when everything becomes expensive, the prices send a signal. It's a wonderful case of markets working and sending signals. And demand shocks, the Great Depression or 2008, demand shocks in both cases emanating from financial crises, financial shocks, have a tendency to turn globalization in the other direction. And so I tried in this book to make a typology of these crises, and you can see that sometimes it's a little bit mixed, and you get supply and demand crises simultaneously, so they're not as easily separable as they are in the, my basic story of the mid-19th century, negative demand, negative supply shock, 1970s negative supply shock, 1920s and 30s negative demand shock. The First World War in particular is a mixture of a supply shock and a demand shock, and it explains, I think, the craziness and the contradictoriness of policy over the next decades. And it seems to me that we're in some ways reliving that moment of a mixture of supply and demand shocks. Let me just focus in a little bit on why and how the negative supply shocks have generated a lot of the uncertainty that we're in after 2020. The basic supply shock is from COVID, but what COVID does is then to make sure that everybody who controls some kind of resource thinks that they can use it. And so I think it's an explanation, for instance, of the radicalization of President Putin's policy and why he makes the decision, terrible decision, in February 22 to invade Ukraine. So he thinks that because Russia controls a lot of energy supply, it can use that as a weapon against the rest of the world, and it can constrain it. So there's a lot of work about it, and it's very, very interesting because the point of these supply shocks is that they are often very, very specifically focused. And so I think one of the best and earliest studies of this was the EBRD transition report a couple of years ago, and they have a chapter on this. And I highlight this table. I obviously can't discuss it in detail, but here is a list of all the critical commodities that are crucial to the green transition. And you can think about them, and anybody who controls anything on this list, and a lot of these are controlled by China, anybody who controls anything on this list is in a very powerful position. But we don't know which ones are the most crucial. And one of the things that we find is that the focus on choke points varies from time to time. So one of the things, for instance, that we suddenly learned in February 22 that I don't think anybody had paid any attention before was that semiconductor manufacture depends on neon gas. Where do you get neon gas from? Again, something that nobody knew before February 22, but a lot of people worried about it after that, is that it's a byproduct of a particular steel manufacture process that was basically only done in the former Soviet Union, and so only practically done in Russia and Ukraine. And the war interrupted that, and so we got a constraint on the supply of semiconductors in the immediate aftermath of 22. The EBRD report in 2023 focused on gallium and germanium, on these rare earths and critical minerals that were important for electric vehicle production and solar panels. On that big table, there's also a brief mention of dysprosium, but there's no discussion of dysprosium at all in the text. And I think it's only recently that we've begun to absolutely be centrally aware that dysprosium is at the key of a lot of the contemporary issues, because this is something controlled by China, which we need for the production of magnetic shields, high-resistance magnetic shields, that are important, for instance, in developing nuclear fusion, but also in many, many computer and advanced data processing techniques. And so the limitation on dysprosium is a critical story. And getting substitutes for these, well, of course you can do that over some time, but you can't do it quickly. And the consequence is that not just do you get increased prices, and the increased prices will send the signal, of course, and you will get a correction in the end. But in the moment, you get a absolutely strategic incapacity to do anything. And it's that that I think is the core reason why the April the 2nd move and why the movement to tariff wars has been so disruptive. But let me just put it in terms of the classification of different reactions. For the United States, April the 2nd, Liberation Day, is a big negative supply shock. For the rest of the world, it's primarily interpreted as a demand shock. So we're exactly in the kind of First World War situation where there are simultaneous supply and demand shocks, and you will expect different reactions. So the reaction that I think you may get, and that is part of Chris's optimistic scenario, is that this will tell us that we simply need to develop more supply everywhere, more supply all over the world, in this country, but in many other countries, and that's a route out. And so it is, I think, quite possible to see that more globalization rather than less globalization could be an outcome of all this uncertainty, but that looks rather distant. And in the meantime, we have the kind of uncertainty that Torsten reminded us of at lunch. And so I thought this story is absolutely crucial. You saw this slide already at lunch, but this is the story of stagflation. The likelihood of stagflation, increasing likelihood of stagflation. And that, of course, really takes us back straight to the world in the 1970s. And you remember, again, that the 1970s, in the end, has a good outcome, and it makes for better policy making and a more openness in policy making, but it's a tumultuous political process before you get there. In the interim, let me just put this together by thinking of some lessons from these moments from the 1840s or the 1970s. In both cases, you had surges of inflation, and they weren't really strictly transitory in the sense of, as it was debated in the immediate aftermath of COVID, but they needn't be long-term either. But they're somewhere in between. And in particular, there are also moments in which relative prices change. And so it's actually very difficult in this kind of setting to think of the standard guidelines that we use when we want to think about monetary policy, because we rely a lot on that, on aggregates, on baskets, on measurements of inflation. But this is a moment when relative prices move very quickly. Secondly, these moments are moments in which there's an intensified pace of technical innovation. And thirdly, they produce more great power political conflict. So, one of the ironies of this moment in the middle of the 19th century was that people like the great Victorian free traders, like Cobden and Bright, said, this is going to make peace. And then very, very quickly, there was the Crimean War. It was the worst episode in interstate conflict since the Napoleonic Wars. And then the critics said, aha, this shows that peace doesn't necessarily result from commerce. So we're in that moment of a very, very conflictual moment. And let me go back to one of Schumpeter's observations. He's very much thinking about, in these moments of doubt and where we don't know where we're going, we go back to atavistic ideas, and we think we need big gold hoards. And so, one of the things that we haven't had all that much in the discussion so far is the discussion of gold in the international monetary system, but it's striking that that's part of the story of the movement away from the dollar. And if you think about the last 10 years, Russia, China, India, Turkey, Kazakhstan, and then more recently, European allies of the United States, Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland, have been building up massive, massive gold reserves. So this is a reflection of doubt about the international financial system, and it leads us to a very, very kind of atavistic view in which seizing gold is important. And that also, I think, is part of the obsession that we're going through just at the moment in the United States. Thank you so much.
So we have about 14, 15 minutes for questions, please. And when I will take like 2 or 3, and please give your name. And I'm going to start with my former professor, Sebastian, and then we'll go to Steve Davis.
Thank you so much. Is this on? Yeah. Great panel. I want to talk a little bit about gold. Harold ended with gold and its current situation, $3,300 an ounce. That's a lot of money. But I want to go back to Matteo's timeline, which I thought was very interesting. And he talked about reputation and credibility, and pointed out that in 31, the United Kingdom devalued sterling up by 30% or so and never recovered. What is missing in that line is that in 1933, the US not only abandoned the gold standard, but it abrogated the gold clauses. And it basically, or literally, defaulted on private and public debt. It devalued the dollar in January of 34 by 41%. And in 35, the Supreme Court said that it was okay to abrogate gold contracts retroactively. And nothing happened. Credibility was maintained. It actually increased. And we had a new equilibrium where, as Barry Eichengreen and Chris and others have documented, gold came back to the US and we got out of the Great Depression. So the question is, there is an alternative to the doom scenario. I am personally pessimistic, but I think that if we look back at history, there is an outcome already in history where the hemigon defaults and maintains its privileges. And the question to the panel is, what are the probabilities of that outcome being the final outcome? And Chris had an optimistic outcome, but he didn't give us probabilities. And I think that looking back at history, the abrogation of the gold clause is a very, very important episode.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more and then we'll merge them together. So Steve.
Thanks, Steve Davis. Great panel. There's an important aspect of the present moment that I thought was missed in the discussion. And I want to draw the contrast between the current tariff hikes and Smoot-Hawley. Smoot-Hawley was a piece of legislation that passed Congress. The tariff hikes and gyrations in the last 3 months are entirely the whim of one man, and most of these tariff hikes are being, the alleged lawful authority is either to legislation that never mentions tariffs or legislation that appeals to emergencies, whereas the kinds of things that President Trump is concerned about are long-run trends. And I think this reveals something important about the present moment that affects the outlook for uncertainty and for further globalization. In particular, we're seeing a moment with tariffs, and maybe in some other respects as well, where there's unrestrained exercise of executive authority without clear grounding in the law or even the Constitution. These matters are being litigated now. They will eventually reach the Supreme Court, and perhaps that will reimpose some constraints. Perhaps under some circumstances, one can imagine that Congress might take back explicitly its power to set tariffs. But until there's some kind of reimposition of constraints on the executive's authority to raise or lower tariffs at the president's whim, I don't see how we get back to the situation. We can have trade deals, but they don't mean much because they're not credible. And so in that respect, I see this current moment as quite different from, say, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs and so on. And it speaks to me to the need for internal US reforms to get us back to where we were before, both domestically, but also with respect to the possibilities that the United States might again become a linchpin for a global economic commons. So on that pessimistic note, I will stop.
So let me turn it over. I'm not sure who's going to want to take these on. Sebastian's question is there room now for the U.S. to abandon some obligations? What would the ramifications be? Would it be catastrophic, or might it be different? And then Steve Davis's point about that now is different, that some of the historical analogs don't hold because partially what's going on is an assertion of executive authority. So please.
Take a go at it. So to Sebastian's question, so Sebastian has a wonderful book on exactly that episode. I would say that that has happened again in '73. Nixon went off Bretton Woods, and money flowed to Switzerland. Switzerland went to negative interest rates and capital controls. Eventually, we came to our senses that Switzerland is too small, and there was no alternative, and the US has survived as being central. The question is, do you want to take a chance? the UK was forced into that, and the existence of an alternative, the US being ready to take on the monetary hegemony, might have facilitated the permanent exclusion of the UK from the role. So there is certainly a vague sense that, as Margaret Thatcher put it, there is no alternative plays a role into this. It's a very informal notion, particularly, at least in economic analysis, but as China develops, as the European Union might get its act together in terms of capital markets integration, any signal that you're not going to fulfill your obligations in the presence of alternative can be very expensive. And so I don't know that anybody, I certainly don't have a good guess of whether you could get away with it or not, but I certainly have a very good guess in why on earth would you even try, and rather than play the good equilibrium. To Steve's question, I mean, again, Steve has done amazing work with Nick Bloom on uncertainty in text, and I piggyback on top of that in my remarks. I think you're totally right. A lot of what is happening is uncertain. It's uncertain not just because it changes very quickly, but also because even if it were to stick, it would have to go through a lot of litigation, and presumably through Congress that might assert more of its authority in the tariff space. That's where I think the text and the high-frequency data makes a huge difference. The firms have to react to this in real time. They don't have the benefit of waiting 3 years and figuring out whether Congress woke up and we didn't have the tariffs. And so a lot of the effects that we're seeing are coming from pure uncertainty and volatility rather than anything that is carrying on the books. There are some on the books. I mean, there's the steel tariffs, the tariffs from the earlier part of administration that the Biden administration didn't take down. So there is certainly some already there, and there is evidence that they're stuck around through 2 administrations, in fact. And so I don't know that if I were doing this as a firm, I would have a expectation that these things are not going to happen or they're going to be quickly reverted, given what we've seen in the last 2 administrations. But it's a big part of and that's also why I think looking at the actual tariffs that get implemented would miss most of the economic action, and the uncertainty index and things like that play a very big role in thinking about what are people actually reacting to.
Thanks. Harold, I know you wanted to jump in. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, in a way, interestingly, the 2 questions, I think, have a kind of link together. First of all, with Steve Davis's question about the tariffs and the difference between Smoot-Hawley and the present, yes, that's absolutely right. But I think in both cases you can kind of get a learning effect in that one of the things that people quickly realized about Smoot-Hawley was that it was the result of congressional action, and that it was going through Congress that increased what Herbert Hoover had originally had as a very, very modest agricultural tariff into this massive tariff book. And so the reaction to that is in the Roosevelt administration with the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act in 1934 to take the power back to the president because the president has an overall view of the United States rather than thinking about each little bit of it where some congressman will benefit from some particular bit of tariff. I think we're going, and we are having that. I mean, in terms of constitutional challenges, and many people are making exactly the point that you're making, that these tariffs are actually unconstitutional, and they demand to be challenged. And so you can expect a shift back to Congress. But the link to Sebastian's question is the rather odd fact that Roosevelt really enjoyed, after he played he abrogated the gold clause, he enjoyed fixing the exchange rate of the dollar in an arbitrary way. And so famously, he liked to joke with Treasury Secretary Morgenthau that he was fixing the rate of the dollar for the day by looking at the tea leaves that he poured out of his teapot. In the same way as this was a kind of arbitrary exercise, we came back then to the conclusion that we actually need a rules-based framework, and that brings us really, really back to the world of 1944 and the Bretton Woods Conference and the world of rule-based monetary policy.
Christopher, did you want to?
Yeah. A little bit on what Steve said. I agree with what Harold said. Tariffs have seemingly become a tool of foreign policy as much as economic policy, which leads to new complications that we haven't seen before, and it's not totally clear whether Congress wants to take back the powers that it originally had and has given in various trade acts. So we'll have to monitor that situation and see how the courts decide. And I think our best chance is public opinion. We'll get immediate feedback in the months to come on the effects of tariffs, and my guess is that many, as per Matteo's charts, will be hurt from these tariffs, and that will swing public opinion. But again, there's the foreign policy imperative, which ties back into the first talk on this panel, which is getting more interesting by the day.
Please. Yes, right behind you, man with the white shirt, no tie. I like no tie.
Thank you. Krishna Guha with Evercore. I wanted to return to this question of this instability zone that Matteo referenced in his presentation. It strikes me that while there are lots of contradictions within the administration's trade agenda at the moment, the dangerous contradiction is between the trade policy and its implications for capital flows and the fiscal situation and the risks that are attendant to that. And of course, as the panelists have rightly said, it's not just attempting to compress trade deficits themselves, it's the wider retreat from international economic integration that this represents, and indeed potentially security integration as well. So even in the baseline case, that's likely to reduce the convenience yield on holding risk-free dollar-denominated securities. And that's going to increase the monetary interest that you need to pay on your government debt. And it seems to also increase the likelihood that at some conjuncture you could reach a global buyer's strike. For instance, if the deficit were to explode in a cyclical downturn with a lot of discretionary fiscal stimulus to try to buy your way out. So beyond observing that we're in this terrain where you could have multiple equilibria, is there anything that we can say beyond that to bring some sort of discipline to thinking about how we might switch from one equilibrium to another? Is it pure sunspot stuff, or can we think about this in a more operational perspective, if you like?
Please, yes.
Thank you. Kana Norimoto from Fidelity Investments. Just to build on Krishna's question with regards to capital flows, I'd like to invite the panelists to tell us what they think is the right policy solution for the potentially hyper-mobilized financial flows that we may see on the back of this. I think it's quite interesting that we've already had an appreciation of the Taiwan dollar last week. It seems some of our Asian allies are thinking that perhaps they need to appreciate their currencies to placate our current administration. And this could mobilize through the FX channels a significant unwind of the investments that they have made into our markets. So I'm curious in particular if there are any lessons to be learned from the sterling area and how we are able to, how can we solidify some of the capital that is actually held by our allies abroad. Thank you.
And Michael, yes.
Make one quick comment. If somebody else raised this, I apologize. I had to step out for a few minutes. But Chris, you had these beautiful graphs of the history of tariffs and how they had not, high tariffs did not necessarily lead to increased prosperity. But much of the discussion of tariffs that's going on now has a flip side that is kind of nutty in a sense, because for much of the history of tariffs, they were the major revenue source for the federal government. They were there to raise money to fund the government, not just to protect industries. Of course, there was protection and so on, it's differentiated, et cetera. But that was one of the two main purposes in any event. And obviously, we didn't have an income tax. You couldn't have an income tax in 1820, okay. But nowadays, obviously, we have many more tax devices. We have, for better or for worse, we have debt. And tariffs, even the ones we're talking about, if you make any reasonable calculations, would be a tiny fraction of revenue. So I just think that people who kind of relate to the 19th century are kind of missing half the story. That's all.
So I've done a bad job as moderator. So I want to give everyone a chance to have closing remarks and give you, also means you can just choose whichever question you want to answer. I'm going to add in another question more for HR because I'm very interested in the strategic elements, and that is, given the things that you're saying, how has the U.S. been doing over the last 5 years? I want to give a broader perspective, not just focus on one administration. And where are we really going wrong? Where are we really going right? So let's go in reverse order, and please keep it short.
Okay, very briefly, revenue and tariffs. I think that's enormously important, but it also makes me think about what might be the reaction of other countries to the chaos. And so one of the possible measures that you might think about is that other countries might say, well, you, the United States, are terribly worried, or at least Mr. Miran seems to be terribly worried about the way in which the inflows of capital into the United States have created this extraordinary, exorbitant liability rather than an exorbitant privilege. So we're going to help you. We're going to put a tax on revenue that comes from investments in the United States. And it seems to me that this would be a plausible and attractive for the revenue issue, from the revenue point of view, an attractive countermeasure that many countries would be absolutely justified in thinking about. Aggressive, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I don't think we should extrapolate 100% from the past, but I would say that in the 19th century, tariffs were as much about restriction as revenue. When revenue got too high or too low, they adjusted the tariffs by fractions, of the prevailing tariffs, percentage points of GDP, and tariffs were about 30% on average, and didn't climb down too much from that in the course of those years. So, there was a lot of restriction, a lot of lobbying, and some revenue issues. I think the parallel between the sterling area and what's going on now, from what I've heard, I guess there's a paper by Stephen Miran about renegotiating long-term debt, and it reminds me, yes, of putting sterling balances on lockdown. But there are other experts like Catherine Schenk on that should be here and be talking about that. So I'll just say that's interesting, and thank you.
So 2 remarks on what you asked me. The first is, you get lucky in these situations if the market starts signaling a problem and you have time to get to your senses, but there is no guarantee of that. In fact, we normally model this as runs on a country because they look like a bank run. Everything is fine until it isn't. And what lures you into the big problem is precisely the absence of market signals. Now, you can argue that in the last few weeks, we started seeing market signals with treasuries and the dollar trading off the usual pattern with equities, that we should come to our senses. That's great. But really, you should have no confidence that the markets are going to give you a long leeway to see it coming. This might happen very quickly. In some sense, the monetary system is really built on fiscal capacity and confidence evaporates very, very quickly. So we used to say the US is the world banker and mean it as a positive thing of you have assets and liabilities. After 2008, we say the US is a world banker, and hence you might blow up pretty quickly. You might get a run on the country. And that's a scary scenario, and you want to stay far away from it. And if you're a large debtor and you start mentioning not repayment, that's the quickest way to precipitate a crisis. It kind of becomes self-fulfilling as people worry about you. So I'm very surprised to see officials talking about we might do something about this. That just normally would be the one advice that we would confidently give if please don't. Similarly, accounting identities, I teach a class in international macro. There's some stuff that is pretty boring, like, the capital account and the trade balance. You can't have capital flows but run a big trade balance. That stuff seems to become fascinating again because people get it wrong. I used to teach it and people were really bored. Now I used to teach it and it's in the New York Times every day. It's the same thing as like, no, imports do not subtract from GDP. Yes, we do write them as a minus in the accounting identity. No, it doesn't mean a negative. Getting those things right seems easy and a very nice thing to do in policy compared to the usual space where we've done those things right and what's left is the things where reasonable people might disagree. So I think a lot of the advice is on the really basics. Let's just get those rights, and that will be a better world to be in.
Hey, just quickly to address Ross's question and then also Steve's earlier question. I think that we're not doing enough to counter Chinese economic aggression. I think where a lot of the historical analogies break down that we've been talking about is that in the the 19th and 20th century, we didn't have a Chinese Communist Party that was really was a Leninist system. We assumed maybe in the 1990s, early 2000s that, to quote Dr. Evil, that the Chinese Communist Party was the Diet Coke of communism, but they're not. I mean, they're the real Coke of communism, and they want to tear down the existing rules of international discourse and replace them with a new set of rules that is sympathetic to their system. And I think you have to pay attention to a few things: what Xi Jinping says, what he does in terms of with the economy and with the buildup of the military, and I think that all indicates that Xi Jinping is preparing China for war, and is trying to use, I think, a lot of our lack of attention to how we're underwriting our own demise in his favor. So I think what we've done in the last several years, last 5 years, and going back to 2017, is we've recognized the nature of the challenge. A lot of the international investment flows into China that were in many ways the scaffolding that was holding up their system has dried up. I think that's a positive indication. And I think there's a recognition that we have to put into place a strategy that integrates all the tools of economic statecraft and efforts of like-minded partners to counter various forms of Chinese economic aggression. To get this to Steve's question on the tariffs and everything, and the kind of jumbled nature of this policy, I think it would be really critical to just to kind of clarify objectives, right? And is it to generate revenue? Is it for national security? Is it to counter unfair trade and economic practices? I would say it's the latter too, and I would recommend a few clear objectives that we should orient on, cognizant, as I mentioned in the introductory remarks, of not compromising the strength of our free market economic system and our sort of unbridled entrepreneurship and our ability to mobilize private capital and not have the state being the allocator of resources. The first of these would be to reduce China's coercive power over the U.S. economy. I mentioned that Vladimir Putin had assumed that he had created a high degree of dependence on Russian natural gas and oil to a degree that he could do whatever the hell he wanted. So we know from that case that that's a bad practice, to give a hostile authoritarian regime coercive power over your economy. The second would be to bolster the resiliency of supply chains that are critical to national security. Scott Atlas and I worked on a piece, in 2017, on the degree to which we have allowed the pharmaceutical supply chain to be controlled by China. This was, of course, at the height of, 2020, the height of COVID. And of course, this applies to a lot of critical materials, some of which I think Christopher, you mentioned them. Did you, Christopher, mention these at the end of his brief? The third would be to expand our defense industrial base to strengthen national security and ensure our ability to mobilize in wartime. We have seen our industrial base atrophy to an alarming degree, and we have to do something about that. I mean, I think it's an urgent matter. Are tariffs part of that? Probably, but there are a range of other policies that I think would be even more important than tariffs themselves. The fourth would be to counter Chinese economic aggression and to protect, the U.S. Critical economic and defense-related competitive advantages. And this would be, of course, IP theft, subsidization, the vast overcapacity and dumping activities to ensure that we can't regain our footing in some critical supply chains or industrial bases, and then finally, to set policies that foster economic growth and innovation. And kind of an offensive-minded policy to take advantage of our free market economic system. So I think that's what's missing. There isn't a discussion of what the heck we're trying to achieve with tariffs, but also with the broad range of tools of economic statecraft. I do think there's a good team coming in. It's really important to understand that I don't know how many people have the Senate confirmed. I mean, 60 or something, I think. So that there are good people who are going to be coming into government in commerce and treasury and defense who I think have very good ideas and a strong knowledge base on how to apply the tools of economic statecraft to accomplish clearly defined objectives. So what I would expect to see is a much better explained and more rational approach in the months ahead.
And please join me in giving all the panelists a hand.